One of the things we can do from within the part settings is we can rename system parts. And so if you're like me, when I started using CabinetVision, there was some terminology that was kind of strange to me. Things like calling corner blocks gussets or sub-ends or deck. And there was just some, like I said, odd terminology that I wasn't really familiar with. So in this video, we're going to look at how we can change that. Now, I will insert this one thing. I would advise you to just get used to the terminology and keep it the same, because if you get a support technician or you're watching a video online, I think it's confusing if you go and change a lot of the system terminology. However, it doesn't mean you can't do it. So let's take a look at an example. So one thing to me is, what is a gusset? I would much rather see this as corner blocks. So let's just edit the description. This will not change the actual part name behind the scenes, but it changes the friendly description. So for example, if I go into my material schedule and go to case interior, I'm no longer going to see gusset here, but I will see corner block. So that actually does a nice job of updating and feels pretty natural. So the other thing, like there's a deck and a bottom, and why they call a base bottom a deck, I have no idea. But let's just take a look at another example. Maybe I do want to call this, I'll just call this a base bottom. And we can do that. And like I said, it does a pretty good job of updating throughout the system, so it doesn't feel like you changed it. Now, if we go into the construction method and things, like it's still going to refer to corner blocks as gussets. But for those of you who are set on calling things a certain way, now you know exactly how to do it. One of the more important things you'll do in the part settings is controlling which parts are allowed to come into Screen to Machine Center to be machined. So in this case, I opened that job that we were working on in a previous section. And you'll notice when I come into Screen to Machine Center, I'm seeing a lot of stuff here that I don't really want to machine. Notice there's countertop, splash, door left and right style. I don't want to machine these parts that are made out of solid wood. Now, technically, yes, I could uncheck these things and filter out just for the plywood, but ideally, I only want to show up what I'm going to be machining to save time so I don't have to filter this every time. So let's just quickly look at some of the things that I want to remove. Obviously, anything countertop related I want to take off. All the door parts, I might keep the slabs in case you're going to do one-piece doors. And we'll remove the rollout and drawer box parts. Making drawer boxes or rollouts out of plywood, you obviously don't want to remove them, but I'm going to assume that I'm doing mostly solid wood. And looks like that's going to be the majority. So let's go back to the main screen and I'll show you how to turn on or turn off this setting. Okay, so if we click on the part menu and we go to assembly. Now you can view assembly just from right here, or you can actually expand it and get a better, more interior and kind of a more narrowed focus here. So actually, instead of interior, I'm going to start with the countertop parts. So I'm going to go to the countertop section and I'm going to go to the second tab called CNC. Now there's three settings in CNC. There's optimize, ignore grain, and CNC. So optimize just means, is this part allowed to nest? So think of like a piece of plywood. Parts are nested on a piece of plywood, and so it needs to be able to optimize on that sheet. So for a lot of you, optimize and CNC goes hand in hand. What this helps give you control over is if you want to send some parts to your nested base router and some parts to just a part by part machining CNC. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off all of this countertop stuff for optimize, and I'm also going to turn it off for CNC. And I'm going to go to my door parts. I'm going to go to the CNC tab, and you'll notice my stiles and rails are not optimizing. Those are solid wood. Now, for whatever reason, they're still going to the CNC, and so if I had a secondary machine or a part CNC, it would still try to output this. So I'm going to uncheck all of the door parts. Now, I will keep door slab, because if I say I do a vertical or horizontal grain slab door, I still want to be able to cut out that slab. Now, the other setting kind of speaks for itself. It's called ignore grain. You can also do this at the material level, but there's some parts you may never care which way they're rotated, no matter what material is being used. So for example, sometimes where I've seen this being used is if I go to my assembly part and I'll go to toe kick. So I've seen some people turn on the ignore grain on front and back toe because it's going to be covered by a toe skin anyways, so they might as well let it rotate to get better yield on their optimization. So that's up to you. And other places I've seen it also is, say, a nailer. Another good, by letting the optimizer rotate those parts any way it chooses, you will see a little bit better yield. But then your cabinet does look a little bit interesting when you have grains running every which direction. So use your discretion on which ones are allowed to rotate and which ones the grain needs to stay the way that you designed it. Now, let's go back into that job and look at our changes. Okay, so I've opened the job, and I'm going to go to Utilities and update the job. And I'm going to go back to Screen to Machine Center. Okay, so this is looking much better. Notice there's no countertop, there's no door left style, no door right style. Now, I did forget to do the rollouts and the drawers, but that's okay. So one other thing I'm going to mention at the end of this video is, what if you sometimes make plywood drawers and sometimes they're solid? Well, there are more ways to control which parts go to Screen to Machine. And I will do a example UCS when we get to the UCS section to be able to. So I mentioned earlier about the drawer boxes and rollouts. Well, what if some of the times you do make it out of plywood and other times it's made out of solid wood? What do? Well, obviously you don't want to turn that off, because if you need it to go to Screen to Machine, you need to leave it on in the parts settings. Now, there are other ways that we can remove parts from Screen to Machine Center if you'd rather not deal with filters, and that would be done through a UCS, which we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I might even include that in one of my example UCSs, is the ability to remove parts based on certain conditions. Okay, let's quickly go back to our parts menu and review what we did. So back in the parts library, if I go back into countertop, because we turned off Optimize and CNC, those parts no longer showed in Screen to Machine Center. We could never machine countertop. So again, the decision for you is, if I ever need to machine this type of part, this setting needs to be on. And if I want it to be on a nested sheet, Optimize also needs to be on. And like I said, for most of you, these will be in sync. They'll either both be on or they'll both be off. The only time you would ever not have Optimize and leave CNC on is if you're outputting to a part by part machine, or what I would call more of a secondary machine rather than a nested base machine. Another thing we can do from within the parts menu is we can control which parts are allowed to receive the room finish color. So I created a little test job, and I went to the 3D tab and went to finishes and picked this bright blue color for my exterior. The interior is this tan color, and so we can see the top stretchers and the nailers, the toe kick and the bottom. All of those parts have the tan color, but the doors and the finished ends have the blue color. So how do they know which ones are allowed to be blue? So let's close this job and go look at that. If I go to the parts menu, and I'm going to go to exposed and go to the finishes tab. And so in the exterior section, or the exposed section, a lot of these are checked, which makes sense. So think of it as, if it's checked, it's going to be blue. And I'm going to treat finishes and textures as practically the same thing. Because if you want it to be the blue color, you also likely want it to be whatever the room texture is. Now, if I go to the interior tab and go to finishes, almost none of these are checked. The only exception is the bottom of a wall cabinet bottom. And a lot of people do finish that, so that makes sense that that should be blue. So if you were somebody who randomly wanted to include nailers in your finish color, if I would check this, maybe the front and back, depending on which way the nailers are facing, but if I would check this, they would become blue. And so you're probably not gonna need to edit this, but I did wanna cover it so you knew what these two tabs were for, and if you got into a job and you were seeing a different color than you were expecting, now you know how to do it. Now, one thing I do want to mention, it's not quite as obvious as it may seem depending on how you set up your materials. Under normal circumstances, so let me explain. If I would check the nailer finish color, and if I would go back into my test job and update my job, it still wouldn't be blue. And that's because my nailer is currently assigned to my UV material. If I go find UV, and my UV material is hard set to a certain finish color. The only way that part setting works is if whatever material that part is using is set to automatic. So again, kind of quirky, and you're probably not going to need to make that change, but that's what those tabs are for. That's how we can utilize it, and it may come in help. And it may be beneficial to you one day now that you know what it does. One of the more exciting things that you can do with the parts menu is you can actually add new part types. And I want to give you a couple examples and explain a little bit how this works, because I think a lot of people can get hung up on this. So the first example, let's say I want to use a separate material for my base nailer than I want to for my wall nailer. Well, if I go into my material schedules and go to case interior, I only have one part called nailer. So how would I do this? Should I create a whole separate material schedule for bases and walls? Well, we could, but as you know, I'm a big fan of keeping lists very short. So let's create a new part called wall nailer. So I'm going to hit return. I'm going to go to parts. I'm going to go into the interior section and I'm going to hit new. So I'll just call it wall NA, and I'm just matching a regular nailer is called NA, so I'm just going to put a W in front. It's whatever you want to name it. Once you're adding a new part, the system knows nothing about it, so you can name it whatever you want to. And I'm going to call it nailer wall, just so it sorts beside this one. If I'd put wall nailer, it would be one would be at the top and one would be at the bottom. And then just so I don't get confused later on, I'm going to rename this to nailer base. Now if I hit return and go to material schedules, go back to my case, and now we have a separate material we could assign. So let's say, for example, that the wall nailer used plywood, but the base nailer used solid wood. Now we have an easy way to do that from within our material schedules without creating duplicates. Now, before you get super excited, because yes, that's a very cool idea, just doing this isn't enough to actually make this happen. Because like I said, Cabinet Vision doesn't know anything about this new part that we created. We have to tell it when and how to use it. And so there would need to be a UCS or object intelligence that calls out this new part or replaces the nailer with this new part in order for us to actually utilize this. But this is a very good strategy, and this is definitely one of the examples of a UCS that I'm going to give later on, because most people are going to need this. Because some people, maybe they use 1/4 inch backs on their base and 1/2 inch backs on their uppers, or the nailer situation, or whatever it may be. We can add new part types to prevent us from creating all these different duplicate material schedules. Example number 2 is, let's say we're adding a brand new part that Cabinet Vision doesn't really have something for. So the first example that comes to my mind is if you're building frame cabinets and you're using the rear back brackets with the bloom slides. There's some people that put like a small nailer behind those brackets so that they have something to mount to, and then they can just move it around and staple it fast. It just makes it easier to adjust. So in this case, what system part would I possibly relate that to? How do I know whether, should I use the nailer part? But how do I know that that's always going to be the material I want that part to be? So in the case of coming up with a whole new situation that Cabinet Vision doesn't really have a plan for, we can create a part for that. So I'm going to call this rear bracket nailer, for lack of a better word. So I'm going to go back to parts, and where you highlight here is important because this is what makes it show up correctly in the material schedule. So if it's a finished part, put it in the exposed section. If it's an interior part, put it here. So I'm going to create a new part, and what did I say I wanted to call it? Rear bracket. And then try to keep the part name somewhat short. You'll be glad whenever you're writing UCSs later if it's not super long. So maybe just RB and then the nailer. Okay, now we have that new part type. And so what I would do is I would go to my material schedules, go to case, and now I have another part to assign, rear bracket nailer. And so I could say, okay, I want to use 1/2 inch one-sided UV always for my rear bracket nailer. Now I'm actually on my finished interior schedule, so that's a little bit weird. Let me go back to my normal one and go to rear bracket nailer and put my 1/2 inch one-sided on there. And there we go. Now, like I said, that's not magically adding that part into Cabinet Vision and making it work. There's still some intelligence we have to add in, whether it's UCSs or object intelligence, just like I mentioned before. But what we did is we prep Cabinet Vision so that when we go to write a UCS, now we have a part who knows what it should be because it's for that situation. So this is where things are starting to get a little bit exciting for me. It was important that I took you through everything up to this point, but as we get deeper and deeper into this, and especially UCSs, object intelligence, and custom reporting, that's where things are really going to start getting exciting. So this is not a finished topic, but now you know how to add part, and just know here very soon, you're going to know how to put those new parts to use.